Hi, everybody. This is a lecture about riots, strikes, feuds, election violence, ethnic cleansing, pogroms. Neither of those terms are used, but that's effectively what we're talking about. All of these sorts of things in basically the period in the American South between the Civil War and about, let's say, the 1930s, the Civil War and World War II, effectively. So in some ways, I'll be also have there's another lecture in the schedule on lynching specifically, which is kind of its own separate sort of thing in some ways. And of course, there's a lot of violence that we're not necessarily talking about in the module, which is what we might think of as kind of spontaneous interpersonal violence, domestic violence, all sorts of things like that. But a lot of what we're talking about here, and certainly the things I'm talking about today, are forms of violence that play out in public. And the other thing that sort of unifies this rather disparate bunch of categories that I'm going to talk about today is that they tend to occur between groups of people or individuals who are representative or members of different groups. And these are groups of people whose relation to one another is already structured. And in a lot of cases, it's sort of already structured within some sort of an opposition. So there might be members of two opposing political parties or political factions involved. There might be workers versus employers in strikes or something like that. There could be the police versus the public, which, I think we're sort of familiar enough, certainly with the news in the United States, if not here, in the past 10 or 15 years, to realize that that's often a very oppositional relationship, especially certainly in the US when the police are white and the people you're talking about are African American. And also, sometimes, particularly in the category of feuds, we're talking about extended families where there might be long-standing conflicts, long-standing antagonisms, and so forth that nurture tit-for-tat retaliatory violence over a considerable period of time. It's important to realize that some of these things that I'm talking about today and that we're in the readings for today, some of them are happening in other parts of the United States. So there's certainly nothing distinctively Southern about labor-related violence. In fact, in a lot of ways, if we sort of bracket just for the moment violence against enslaved people and also the kind of labor-related violence that often gave rise to lynchings, right? So lynchings were very often sparked by some sort of an confrontational or violent encounter between an employer and the person working for them. And in most cases, this is an agricultural, farm, rural setting. But in some ways, that's worker versus employer in the same way that it might be in a big factory. It's just that the worker tends to be individual there as opposed to a group, like a big union of people striking or whatever. But certainly labor violence in a variety of forms occurs all across the US. So we can look at the Homestead strike, we can look at the Ludlow massacre in Colorado, we can look at all sorts of things. So labor violence is not distinctively Southern, although I do think that there are ways in which labor-related violence in the South is characterized by a lot of the same issues and structures and so forth that other kinds of violence in the South are characterized by. There's also certainly, disputes and fights and violence between organized sort of groups of families and so forth in other parts of the country. For the most part, I suppose, this maybe occurs in the context of organized crime, maybe more in the kind of late 19th into the early 20th century. So we could perhaps see those as somewhat similar to some of the rural-based family feuds. Things like the Hatfields and the McCoys is the most well-known one, but there are any number of others, particularly in the Appalachians, but not just in the Appalachians. It's important to realize. So the things in this week's lecture and this week's readings are in the South. They are of the South, but in some ways they're not entirely distinct from or entirely separate from the rest of the country. So the point here is the South is more violent in a lot of different ways of measuring. It is characterized by particular forms and factors of violence, but it's not as though it's an island of violence amongst a peaceful, gentle population in the rest of the country in the late 19th, early 20th century. Another way to think about this, so what I'm going to do really is just talk fairly briefly, really, because what I'm not going to do is go through and rehash what's in the readings and sort of tell you exactly what's in the readings because you've already read those. You can sort of get that for yourself. What I am going to do is try to reflect on that and try to pull together some common themes, some observations, and some comparisons that may not be immediately obvious to you as you read the material, but hopefully will give you something to think about and a way of kind of gathering them together and lumping these episodes and these sort of forms of violence together in a way that makes sense, in the way that indeed it made sense to me when I put all these different readings together. And I think one way we can do that is by actually reaching beyond the American South and beyond the United States itself for transnational comparisons and try to see, do we see things kind of like this happening in other places? What do we see happening in other places that we don't see happening here? And so on. And one thing that comes to mind is, interestingly, I don't think it's actually common in the United States, certainly in the late 19th, early 20th century, to see the military, even the National Guard, directed by the government killing people in the American South. Now, I did mention the Ludlow Massacre in Colorado in 1913, I think that is. And that actually is the National Guard, basically in the employ of a mining company directed by the Rockefellers, actually killing miners and striking miners and their families and so forth. So that is the National Guard, which, remember, is sort of a militia force organized at the state level, commanded at the state level, but also susceptible to federal control. So basically, the federal government can kind of reach into the state and control and take command of the National Guard. That's why it's called the National Guard at any point. We see this when the Little Rock conflict in 1957, where the federal government nationalizes the Arkansas National Guard, state militia, and sort of defuses or sort of gets the National Guard out of that, and then actually brings in U.S. Army regular troops to restore order. So in Ludlow, in Colorado, not the American South, we do see the National Guard attacking and killing people, but we don't actually see that much in the South in comparison to where we see that happening elsewhere. So if we think about, for instance, the Peterloo Massacre in the 1810s in Manchester, that's the yeomanry, effectively the local militia, attacking unarmed people and killing a bunch of them and wounding even more of them. Something like Bloody Sunday in Russia in 1905, where you get, again, unarmed protesters being attacked by the army and lots of them killed, or for that matter, Bloody Sunday in Derry in 1972, when likewise unarmed protesters are attacked and killed by regular army soldiers. You don't actually see that sort of scenario playing out in the American South. It's worth thinking and sort of speculating why. I don't have a particular answer for this. This isn't something that there's a lot of scholarship on particularly. It's just kind of a observation about the kinds of public organized violence we're looking at this week and how it compares to other places and what sorts of things that are common forms or relatively common forms of violence elsewhere that we don't actually see in the South. So why don't we see actual military force being used against non-military opponents? And I suppose one thing is and I'll sort of come to this a bit more in a moment, is in general, I think the American state, and particularly the state, and here I'm talking about federal and also state level state, in the American South is substantially weaker than we see in these European countries that I'm comparing with. And the other thing, of course, is what I just slightly alluded to, is the sort of inherent tension and ambiguity and conflict in a lot of cases between federal power and state power, and federal jurisdiction and state jurisdiction. And I think that sort of prevents, certainly in this period, it prevents the sort of military violence against citizens that we sort of see not uncommonly elsewhere. So, to come back to this broad point about, generally speaking, a weaker state, and this is a point that Greg Downs and Kate Mazur made in an edited collection they did a few years ago called The World the Civil War Made. They argue that in the South, after the Civil War, the state, and here I'm talking about the state in a sort of abstract noun sort of way, so I'm not talking about Alabama or Indiana or something like that, right? But the state is relatively weak, and its power doesn't extend very far. Its power really only extends as far as it can actually project force. And so they talk about, and this is a discussion about the Reconstruction period, but in some ways we sort of see this carrying on. They talk about the idea of a stockade state. So basically, in Reconstruction, when the South is lightly occupied by victorious federal troops, the state really only has real power as far as those soldiers can go and actually impose their will. We see something similar for the sort of middle part of this period I'm talking about. If we look at the scholarship of William Link, who writes about all sorts of things, but in the book I'm thinking about the progressive era in the South, and all these progressive things that the federal government is doing and so forth, and why doesn't that really take hold and stick in the South? And he makes a lot of argument in that book about the significance of localism and the resistance to outside power, whether that's the state of North Carolina, but especially federal state power. So a very strong kind of idea, and um, this goes back to in a lot of ways a scholar by the name of Robert Wiebe and his view of how the United States was developing in the late 19th century, and a real sort of strong, what he called island communities that are very self-contained, very local, and the sort of encroaching, centralizing, expanding power of the state slowly integrating all of those together. And Link argues that these sort of island communities remain much stronger in the South. And I think that that makes a lot of sense. It certainly is kind of continuous with the point that Downs and Mazur make about the stockade state. And it has a lot to do with the monopoly on force that the state has, or that a fully functional, fully in charge state has. So, in contrast to a lot of European countries, for instance, I think that what we see in the American South in this period is a state which is unable or unwilling, and in some ways we can play around with whether it's unwilling or whether it's unable and why it's unwilling or why it's unable. But the fact of the matter, it doesn't fully restrain the use of violence by non-state actors, right? This is really important when we're talking about lynching, for instance. It's sort of dead obvious there. But it's also a significant factor in pogroms. And I use that phrase, obviously, it comes out of Eastern Europe and attacks on Jewish communities there. It's not a term, as far as I'm aware, that's used in the US. Although, interestingly, and I'll sort of leap aside a little bit, there is the use of the term vendetta as a direct comparison between Corsica and the feuds in the mountains. of Appalachia sometimes. But pogrom isn't really used, but it's fairly relevant. And what we're talking about here is organized violence against all members of a certain class or a certain community or ethnic identity or whatever, with the goal of removing them from territory and not just attacking them, not just dominating them, not just taking their stuff, but actually removing them from that territory. And this happens all over the South at various times. There's a wave of it. There's a book by Kimberly Harper called White Man's Heaven about this happening in essentially northwest Arkansas and southwest Missouri. Forsyth County, Georgia, in 1912, this happens. And essentially, there are virtually no African Americans in Forsyth County, Georgia, which is kind of just outside of Atlanta, well into the 1980s. And the brief film that's on the reading list is a reminder of what happened when there was a sort of a civil rights march through Forsyth in 1987, and the just powerful antagonism that, these were racist white people who had gotten quite used to not having any black people in that county for a long time. There are other much more localized places. Salem, South Carolina, near where I grew up, was a place where black people just did not go, and if they did go there, they were chased out. I did interviews in Lawrence County, South Carolina, and heard about one corner of that county near a place called Princeton, not Princeton where the university is, but Princeton, Lawrence County, South Carolina, where there was an alleged crime committed by a black man in 1933. And for about 2 weeks or so, there were mobs of people roaming the countryside and chased all the African Americans out of an area about, not a huge area, but about, say, 5 miles by 10 miles. And that was in the 1930s. And in the 1990s, there were no African Americans in that particular area. Something similar happened in St. Genevieve, Missouri, on the Mississippi River in 1930. These sorts of things happened usually in quite small places, but all over the South. In a lot of cases, we get episodes, particularly in the sort of midst of the agrarian crisis in the 1880s, 1890s, called white capping, and that's because people would have, white masks on, usually flour sacks that they'd poke some holes in, kind of like Ku Klux Klan. But white capping is a reference to usually white farmers chasing black farmers out in order to get better, just to chase the competition away, and in order to raise the price that they can get for their labor, or force landlords to lower the rent and so forth, basically so that you don't have white labor competing with black labor. So you have these white farmers chasing all the black farmers out of the neighborhood. That happens a good bit in Georgia, also a bit in Alabama. But these kinds of things happen sort of all over the place, and it's just astonishing, really, when you think about the government, the state, allowing that to happen. And it's an indication that, again, as I was saying a moment ago, the state as such, whether we're talking about state level or federal level, but the state is unable or unwilling to stop non-state actors from using violence to accomplish some pretty considerable things, like chasing people out of a whole area. We also see something similar with election riots. There are lots of election riots. So Wilmington, North Carolina, 1898. Phoenix, South Carolina, which is a tiny, tiny little village that doesn't even really exist anymore, also in 1898. Lots and lots of riots and violence around elections in various times. And again, this is, well, after January 6th, 2021, it may seem a bit less surprising, but until then, it was a bit surprising to see actual outright, or to think about actual outright violence being used to interfere directly in the electoral process. So, we've read Jill Lepore's article about how voting happened in the 19th century. And it was a very physical, confrontational thing. It was a real test of manhood, whether you could march up to the ballot box and put your ballot in and so forth. And this is a big argument for why women shouldn't vote, because the idea is the whole nature of voting, the whole nature of political participation is physical, it is confrontational, it is masculine in all of the worst, most unpleasant connotations of that. And that's a good reason it's not a place for ladies. But certainly by the 20th century, we're sort of thinking, okay, well, that's in the past, and that's not the way that politics works anymore. And except for possibly a few encounters and a few scuffles and so forth during the civil rights movement in efforts by, again, African Americans to register to vote, to cast votes. So there are some things like that. But there's an idea that, direct, large-scale riots around elections are sort of a thing of the past. And they're also something that, again, ties into these other forms of violence and, again, indicates just how unwilling or unable the state is to exercise power even around the very mechanisms that constitute the state, that is to say, elections. I think in the broadest sense, what we see here is that the state as such is unable or unwilling to enforce national laws, because there certainly are laws about all of this, and they're either national laws or in some cases there's not necessarily a federal issue, but there's certainly state laws, but they're unwilling or unable to enforce that over the top of the local customs and local norms. And again, that goes back to the point that Bill Link was making about the progressive era, and he's not really talking in that book about episodes of violence, but he is talking about resistance. And in some cases, you do get sort of violent resistance to some of the measures of the progressive era. So if we looked at Claire Strom's article about cattle tick fever, which may sound really bizarre and unrelated, but if you look that up, you'll find some level of violence against a sort of public health measure, basically, or a public sort of animal health measure. And part of this is, again, to come to this other aspect of it, it has to do with federalism, right? And I think that, I've been teaching in this country for about 20 years, and it's always really important to get across the idea of federalism, that the federal government, and this is especially true maybe in the period before World War II, before there's sort of before the New Deal and especially World War II, when after that the federal government has a much greater reach and it just interacts with daily life and local life in many, many more ways than it used to. But certainly when we're talking about the late 19th century, even into the early 20th century, there's a lot of life that the federal government just doesn't have anything to do with. And that's because the federal government does certain things, but a lot of things are reserved to the states. So the states exercise control over how elections are run. And this has to do with things like the processes, what happens to the ballot box, where is it counted, how are the results reported, and so forth. All those things defined and monitored and enforced by state law. The locations where balloting will happen, the location where voting happens, who's on the local boards for scrutinizing and overseeing elections and all that is under state control. And so particularly in the South, in the period after Reconstruction, between Reconstruction and the Civil Rights Movement, we have white supremacist Democrats largely in control of state governments with a very few kind of episodic interruptions and so forth. But they are controlling what happens and how elections are handled and how elections are run and so forth. And there's not a whole lot of opportunity for the federal government to interfere and to sort of get involved. There is kind of, and it does happen a little bit, but for all sorts of reasons, there's not much of that. And that indeed is why the Voting Rights Act was necessary in 1965 and why it was so important until it was completely gutted by whatever that decision was, Holder versus Shelby County, which I think was about 2010 or so. But anyway, mostly elections governed by states. And again, states have control over lots of things. The federal government has control over some things, but not that much. Also, most crimes, and certainly crimes of violence, are state matters, and the enforcement or not of them remain state matters. And this is true unless there's some sort of a federal aspect to it. So if in 1905, if you beat up the postman or something, that could be a federal crime because the U.S. mail is a federal service, something like that. But if you just, get together with 25 of your neighbors and chase 2 or 3 African American families out of their home, it's not really a federal matter. It's a state matter. And with the white supremacist Democrats in control of the state government and most of the local governments and so forth, they may investigate it, they may pursue it, they may not, probably not. There's also the issue, again, under this rubric of federalism, there's the issue of congressional politics. So Congress at the national level, the politics of that are significant. And especially after the 1890s and the 1900s, when we have the implementation of Jim Crow and the sort of systematic disfranchisement of African American voters in the South, we get this sort of weird dynamic where because there's very tight political control at the Southern level, and there's not a lot of challenge, and the Democrat is going to win, and there's just kind of like, the debates and the contests are really over which Democrat is going to stand in the general election because the Democrat is always going to win. What you wind up with is congressmen and senators going from states to the national level who are very secure in their post. So unless they lose a primary election and they're not the nominee for the Democratic Party from Mississippi or wherever, unless they lose that, they know they're going to get elected. So they get elected over and over again, and they establish a lot of seniority and a lot of the sort of controls over how Congress works and how the committees work and who's the chair of the committee and all that sort of thing depends a lot on seniority. So you have these very long-serving Southern Democratic congressmen and senators who exercise a power really out of proportion to their numbers in Congress. So the South, even once the South is kind of a numerical minority in Congress, Southern white Democrats exercise a lot of power just because they're there for so long. And this power allows them to block lots of legislation. So the greatest example of this is the inability of Congress to pass a law to make lynching a federal crime. Congress can pass a law at any time and say, lynching is a federal crime. But it's consistently blocked by Southern Democrats. In fact, Congress finally did pass a law making lynching a crime. When? Last week. So I'm recording this on the 11th of March, 2022, and Congress they passed a law. I'm not sure if Biden has signed it yet or not, but they passed a law making lynching a federal crime last week, March of 2022. This is after literally 100 years and a little bit more of trying. But of course, the irony is with this lack of federal legislation to actually give federal power an access, a sort of in to enforce and protect rights in the South, it actually helps these senior Southern white Democrats keep getting reelected because it sort of solidifies their power. So it's this funny vicious circle that continues really until the Voting Rights Act in 1965. So to come back, what are some of the effects of all of these various forms of violence that I'm talking about here? And I want to talk about just sort of three broad things. The first of these is something that's encompassed in the phrase black land loss. So there's a period of time, and there was a book by Lauren Schwenninger about African American property owners in the South. And he shows that there is a period of time into the sort of 1880s, 1890s, when African Americans they're not owning as much land proportionately as whites, but there is starting finally to be a bit of a class of rural landholding African Americans in the South. And as we know from any place, owning land and having secure tenure on land is really significant. But the kinds of violence that we're talking about, and especially the white capping, the sort of ethnic cleansing stuff that Kimberly Harper was writing about, or that was happening in Forsyth County, or not necessarily just rural, this goes for towns and cities as well, as the report on the Wilmington massacre of 1898 shows. But all of these things mean that black property owners no longer own their land, right? So they get chased away. They're not there. They either, well, they're chased away. They don't have access to their property to earn a living, to farm, or if it's a shop to make money or whatever. They're living someplace else. They either can't pay or don't pay the taxes on the property, and it's sold at public auction to pay off the tax debt and so forth. So these sorts of things happen over and over again in the sort of last couple decades of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. And it's hard to overestimate what a big deal this is, because it really sort of arrests the kind of progress, sort of social economic progress, that African Americans might have been making. So the kind of progress that Booker T. Washington is hoping for, the kind of work hard and keep your head down, keep your nose clean, and live frugally and live decently, and don't be irresponsible. And the white people will sort of get used to you and sort of slowly learn to respect black people and so forth. Not only, I mean, that was a bit pie in the sky, a bit ridiculous, frankly, but even the ability to simply hold on to property is threatened and undermined by the vulnerability of African Americans to violence in this period. What life for African Americans in the American South might have looked like had there been a state that was ready and able to protect them from violence is something well worth thinking about. But we certainly see the effects of this, and it's one of the things that becomes a push factor. When we talk about migration, we talk about push factors and pull factors. And when we talk about the Great Migration, the movement of African Americans from the American South to the Midwest, to the North, to the far West, in the period starting around World War I and then continuing really until World War II and the period right after World War II. That huge movement of people that changes the character of cities across the US and changes the character of the American South. We often think about the employment opportunities as the country is gearing up for war and so forth, but there are also significant push factors, and the violence is a significant push factor in the South. It also means that farming itself, so if we just think about agricultural history in the US and the nature of who is a farmer in the United States, because of this violence, particularly the violence that was aimed at displacing and moving black farmers off their land, it means that farming is not entirely, of course, but farming, especially through the late 20th century, was very much a white business and much whiter than it would have been had that not been the case. And that has a lot of effects. I think a second really broad effect here is a very sort of deep and very reasonable distrust of the police by African Americans. So if we see riots like the Robert Charles riot in New Orleans in 1900, the Atlanta riot in 1906. We have, even going back to the Reconstruction era and the Memphis riot of 1866, we simply have cops killing black people. Lots of cops killing lots of black people, and doing it quite openly, doing it really without repercussion. And there are also really, through this period and through the 20th century, lots of individual one-on-one, totally unjustifiable killings of African Americans by white police. Many of those are never documented or never sort of conclusively documented, but they're there. Now, obviously, in the last, say, 15 years or so, in the era when everybody has a video camera in their pocket all the time, we've sort of tragically become accustomed to seeing, actual videos of these things happening, but we shouldn't pretend or be confused that this is something new. It's something really, in a lot of ways, that has happened for a very long time. It's just much more thoroughly documented now. But certainly things, especially these sort of large-scale riots, when what the police should be doing is stopping the riots and stopping everybody from hurting everybody. And what they're doing all too often is lining up on the side of the rioters or actually instigating the riots themselves. And finally, I just want to say that I think one of the other big effects that all of these sorts of public forms of violence, these riots, these ethnic cleansings, these election violence, the strike breaking violence, and all of this is that it creates powerful obstacles to collective action, right? So when you think about the 1960s civil rights movement, and you think about people marching in Birmingham, Alabama, when you think about people walking across the Pettus Bridge in Selma in 1965, all those sorts of things, it takes incredible courage to do that. And it particularly takes incredible courage when you're living in a region where almost anywhere that you are in the South, there has been some sort of violent public episode by people in power against people without power, whether that was lynching, whether it was an election riot, whether it was, you know, white neighbors chasing black neighbors off the land or whatever. And, those stories are still there. People in the civil rights era, they knew about that. In a lot of cases, their parents, grandparents, great grandparents had experienced this directly. A really good example of this is a book by Timothy Tyson called Radio Free Dixie, about a African American civil rights leader from North Carolina, from Monroe, North Carolina, which is just east of Charlotte, a guy named Robert F. Williams. And he talks about his grandfather in the 1890s, in the time period of this Wilmington riot and the white supremacist political campaign of 1898, defending himself and defending his family. And that's, Robert F. Williams, who was born in about 1920 or 1922, and he grew up hearing these stories. So people in the civil rights movement had to really overcome a lot of obstacles, but not least was just the knowledge that this was a place and political structures and people who had used violence consistently for decades. I think it also means, I think the other thing, in addition to the courage that it took to do things like the civil rights protests, is that in a way, in the South, over a period of decades, violence is always an option. And if you had a more powerful state, if you had a sort of state that, sort of like if you've seen the film The Departed, and that sort of early scene with Leo DiCaprio in the barn, he orders the cranberry juice, and somebody sort of makes fun of him, and he punches the guy, and Frenchie grabs him and says, "Do you know who I am? I'm the guy who says there are guys you can hit and there are guys you can't hit." In a way, the state is Frenchie from The Departed. The state says, you can't hit those people. In fact, you can't hit anybody because if there's going to be hitting done, me, the state, is going to do it. And you are just citizens. You shouldn't be hitting each other, right? And if you have that in place so that violence between individuals, between groups of people that are in conflict, because there's always conflict and disagreement over stuff, but violence is always an easy option. It's always there to go to in the South. If you had a more powerful state to stop that, to put a lid on that, and to sort of force the sort of slow work of negotiation and compromise and calming down and so forth between groups, I think you would have had a very different and much more pleasant and probably much more prosperous and so forth, or at least more prosperous for most people, sort of history in the American South in the late 19th and all the way through the 20th century and even into the 21st century. So those are just a few thoughts, a few observations, a few kind of ideas to hopefully help you organize the rather disparate set of readings and set of sort of things that we were talking about this week. But there are, I hope I've shown, some common threads there.